I could probably ramble about Blue Steel for, an hour, but
Would you still recommend this sort of list and not running a whole new world for players like myself heading to Bochum in a few weeks?
um,
Would you have felt as comfortable testing it if you couldn't get the volume of games that you could get in online testing?
absolutely not.
Guys, Alphos here. Sorry, it's been a while without a video. Today, we're going to be interviewing Sky, who placed top 16 in the latest Chicago Disney Lorcana Challenge. Sky, you are a multi-time online leaderboard champion on the software that shall not be named anymore. Renowned for your mastery of the Blue Steel deck specifically, which in set 1 has had its entire identity revolving around a whole new world, and yet in Chicago, you chose to omit it and still made top 16. So first off, tell me a little bit about that. What led you to that decision? And if you'd like to introduce yourself anymore.
No, I think you did well with that introduction. I think that's more than I deserve for sure. So for the first two sets, if anybody knows me, I'm pretty well known for playing Blue Steel. And of course, the first two sets we played, four wheel, you pretty much built the deck around abusing the fact that you can, play your Fishbone Quill or ramp and then pitch your whole hand and draw a new one. Especially set two when we played things like Bell, it was like, you hyper ramp, you just drop a Bell each turn mid game towards the late game. And if you can keep wheeling, then you keep wheeling, and it's pretty much the strongest thing you can do in the game because you're double, sometimes even triple your opponent's ink. Some games where you go crazy, and you're just abusing that fact. But this meta was a little bit different. So, red and green were the big winners from set four. So I had to kind of think of those matchups in the previous sets, and sometimes in those matchups you didn't want to wheel even going first if they had a particular curve. And so now that they have all these, hyper efficient tools that they've been given from set four, I was hard pressed to believe that the matchup was going to get any better as far as wheeling goes. So I said, well, we got four more popsicles in the form of Fortisphere. What if we just try to, remove the wheel from the deck finally? I always said that in my stream that, if you could run 8 popsicles and if you could run 8 Flavishams, you wouldn't need a wheel. Well, we got the 8 popsicles, so I said maybe it's good enough as just that. We hit one Flavisham, maybe that's okay. And it turns out, yeah, if you hit the Flavisham, you're typically fine most games. In some games, going second, just that one extra card doesn't even require a Flavisham, especially if it's it's a heavy tempo deck. Your opponent just plays on curve and just plays out their hand rather than focusing on, card economy. They're focusing on tempo. You have those steel tools that you can, play Tinkerbell into a Simba is like super tempo heavy. So not only that, but I realized that without playing the wheel, you kind of have the freedom to change your deck up a little bit since you don't have to, always establish a 5-cost singer on 4, ready to sing a wheel, going first. You have the flexibility of, okay, I'm going to go 2-drop ramp into Flavisham, and then after that, I'm potentially going up to 8 ink if I played Fishbone Quill on 3. So I could go into Simba, I could go into an early Tamatoa. You can rush into these bigger threats rather than, like planning for the late game of I'm just gonna turbo ramp and sing a wheel and then establish more, 5-cost and 2-cost and all these double and triple spells. You're much more of an on curve deck that you're playing, bigger threats. And so the change that went into the deck is that you're much more, I'd say, top deck heavy. If you like add up the average cost of cards in your deck versus what I played set 3 versus set 4, I'm sure the curve is like much higher.
So would you say, especially a couple questions here, just leading to what you've already talked about. Firstly, is the idea of the ramp tools we're using now. So obviously Fishbone Quill, a lot of its power potential came from the comboing of Whole New World and not really needing to consider getting rid of extra cards as an opportunity cost because you can just refill your hand. And I see you're running 4 copies of Mickey. Have you favored Mickey more, especially in those Emerald Steel matchups as a ramp tool because it's costing less of your hand?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've always been on Team Mickey versus One Jump, but especially now, like Mickey is so effective at retaining what you have in your hand while still bridging that like crucial gap of from 4 to 5 ink that is like super important for Blue Steel. I think in Swiss I actually only used Fishbone Quill twice on 3 all of day 1. I just wasn't drawing it at first, but then most hands I realized are just more compatible with Mickey than Fishbone Quill when you don't have a wheel. The exceptions are when you have like multiple popsicles and you have the Flavisham. then you can kind of abuse the fact that you're still drawing an absurd amount of cards because Flavisham's just, guaranteed 4 to 6 cards. You can still keep Quill hyper inking then, but if you don't have, multiple pops and it's a matchup where Flavisham might just get brawled right away, you kind of want to conserve your hand with Mickey. You don't need to like hyper ramp right away because you're not really double spelling. You're just playing, good characters every turn for most of the game.
Yeah, so we're talking about the differences with Mickey and how that you didn't play Fishbone Quill often, not necessarily just from not drawing it, but just because Mickey was a better choice in a lot of moments.
Yeah, so one thing when I first started without the wheels that I noticed that the mulligan changes a lot because your curve changes a lot, and so that's one of the reasons why Mickey is much more prevalent. Um, Going second is like much more likely that you can get away with Fishbone because you kind of sometimes need to ramp into those like big threats like Tink on 4 or like Simba on 5 to kind of catch up on tempo, and you have that extra card to pitch with the Quill, so it doesn't feel as bad.
Mm.
Um, but going first, your like ideal curve is just still hit a 2 drop, preferably Smee because it's much more quest and tempo heavy. Um, but then just Mickey into Flaversham, and you'll have a popsicle down. You can even if you don't hit a popsicle on 1, you'll still be able to hit 5 ink on 4, and you can play it beforehand. But going first, it's fantastic if you have it saves that one extra card. Going first, you have the tempo that you want to prioritize the Flaversham draw on for anyways, so we're not like trying to speed run to a Tinkerbell. So
Yeah.
you might as well, take the body, take it. Mickey quests for a lot. Like if you play Smee into Mickey, that Mickey is probably getting you 3 to 4 lore, which is not irrelevant in this style of deck. A lot of times it comes down to like, okay, late game I have a dime established. I play my Ariel, activate my dime, and I get just to that 20 to 22 lore threshold threatening. So those 1 and 2 lores add up like to a lot of important interactions later in the game.
Yeah, it's me into Mickey into Cog because it's definitely just quite a bulky way to, advance tempo going first.
Yeah,
Uh,
so last set that was like the classic Smee, Mickey, into Cog, but this set it's like Smee, Mickey, into Flaversham. Unless you go
mm,
you go second, then you sometimes you want the tempo of like Smee, Mickey, Cog or Smee, Mickey, Beast.
yeah, or having the singer set up for the Tink grab your sword if you need to clear X and freeze.
Sorry, you do a lot less singing in this version though. I will say that because
Mm,
of the card economy, you're not quite as like like I can just sing my whole hand away and then play a wheel. Uh, Sword is actually probably hard casted more than it's sung in this version, which
okay.
isn't a bad thing. Like if it's mainly, I mean, Sword is pretty much in there just completely for green steel this set. So like a lot of times they're going to be Zeusing your first tank or something, so you're just hoping to rip a sword off the top and hard cast it and clear their
Yeah.
entire board of Bucky's, Diablos, all that jazz.
Okay. Yeah, and on that note, with how different it is this set and how different is this deck with singing, how different does the pivot away from Whole New World and these sort of different openers change your mulligan into different matchups, especially into really the 4 big threats of red, blue, emerald steel, red, purple, and the blue steel mirror?
Yeah, so you have much less draw options. We don't even play stuff like Gaston anymore, so our only draw is Flaversham or sometimes a Beast, which in a lot of matchups doesn't see the light of day unless you're going first. So the way I viewed this originally was I used to play certain variations of red blue um, that heavily relied on Flaversham. I mean, red
Mm.
blue just naturally relies on Flaversham and popsicles to be its entire unfair draw engine that keeps it able to ramp with Fishbone Quill. So you're much more of like a heavy mulligan for Flavisham type deck. So I'll usually keep one popsicle, but almost everything else except a Smee or like a 2 drop if I sometimes even the broom is not good enough unless I know it's green steel. Um, I'll just go for Flavisham. Like if you have Flavisham, especially when going first, you're just in an extremely good spot to stop any unfair curve that your opponent has, and even against your bad matchups. So you're really just hunting for Flavisham with this mulligan. Whereas like it was like before, okay, 2 drop and then ramp, and then we want Cogsworth or our ideal slinger, and if it's a good matchup for wheel, I'll keep a wheel too.
Yeah.
But now it's just completely Flavisham hunting.
And then how do you navigate the matchups where you don't find Flaversham? Obviously, you really can't play Quill without the Whole New World if you don't have Flaversham, right? Unless you're needing to unbrick a handful of unincome.
Yeah, so Quill is really not the greatest if you don't hit the Flavisham. It's okay going second sometimes because you need to skip to that Tinkerbell fast and you have that extra card. but your kind of plan going without Flavisham is just okay. I need to play. I still need to play my ramp. I still want a two drop to stop tempo, especially going second. But you have the opportunity to kind of like ramp into Tamatoa if you miss the Flavisham. Like if you miss Flavisham, you play four Tamatoa, you're likely to hit one of those.
Mm.
So like a lot of times what happens is you'll ramp into something like just a five drop or a Tinkerbell or something, and then you'll just go straight into Tamatoa, and then he's kind of like a miniature Flavisham. You just pop your popsicles and you're just netting one card each turn.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, especially going second, that's enough. You have that extra card, you'll be able to bridge that gap to get to Tamatoa with, maybe one card left, and then you'll just hope the Tamatoa sticks and play the popsicles because you're playing Tamatoa much faster. Not many decks can just sing a let it go. Like they'll have to take their whole turn or like double spelled
Mm.
like Zeus plus strength or something to take out a Tamatoa. So it's pretty likely that your first Tamatoa sticks if you're like rushing into a Tamatoa on like turn six.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed there are a lot less answers to Tamatoa in this meta. I mean, one of those answers that you seem to be running, I assume, is Hades.
Yes, Hades was one of my favorite cards that I'm very glad to be able to play this set, whereas we had to drop him off in set two.
Yeah. I was about to say, yeah, I bought like free Hades in set two, and I remember in set three, I was like, I had one tournament with these guys, and now they're gone.
Yep, he kind of disappeared for a while. So, but now it's crabs are such a huge part of the meta, and of course Cinderella is still kind of a thing for Amber Steel and some Green Steel. So, it's kind of just nice to have a protection against any sort
Mm.
of wonky threat that they drop, especially crabs, because there's a weird kind of end game that happens. It's not even end game. It's kind of can start at mid game, with against red blue, which is of course probably one of the biggest decks going forward after Chicago. It definitely was one of the biggest decks going into Chicago. Um, but you kind of play this weird game of with three Hades, like your opponent kind of has to assume that you have a Hades, but they can't play around it per se because it's so
Mm.
effective that they need to just drop the Tamato and commit early. So they're just like threatening, a two-turn clock out of nowhere and just hope you miss. And then you just punish them hard by playing a Hades, and you have, maybe, six to sometimes even eight lore on board. You just force them to either be prep or they just lose. So Hades is just an absolute all-star in that matchup. But it's one of the reasons why I kind of chose to go no wheel is because it allows us to play those big greedy things and just if you're not refilling your opponent, they might just not have another big threat like Tamatoa. They would have to really have a crazy strong popsicle Flavisham engine going to like guarantee a second Tamatoa right after you Hades their first. So sometimes Hades can just win the game right off the bat against Red Blue.
Yeah, and on the note of threats that are more ever present since Chicago, I've noticed that there seems to be an uptick in the meta and success of Queen's Castle. I, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yes,
but I feel like Queen's Castle is a location that this deck would really struggle with.
Queen's Castle is definitely scary, and I am glad that red purple as well as I mean purple steel is probably a good enough matchup where Queen's Castle isn't quite as scary in that matchup, but it still is just Queen's Castle on four. If you're going second as blue steel is a very hard position to be in, especially if you miss Smee. You kind of have to hit your perfect curve to combat some of these like really strong curves that red purple can do into Queen's Castle. Uh, my philosophy going in was that without wheel, Rise of the Titans is not a great card to be
Yeah,
playing.
I would
We're
agree.
much more top deck focused, so we really need proactive stuff. Like Hades is kind of a good example we just talked about. We're not playing Let It Go or Zeus just because we need bodies and lore attached to whatever we play. So if we have answers that are proactive, that's what we want to be doing. And Rise of the Titans and even Avalanche is just not really that. So if Red Purple is much more of a concern for the meta share, I think I would have maybe tried testing more like 1 to 2 Rise and see how bad it felt in certain matchups. Because if you do hit, Flavisham draw, you can't afford to double spell later in the game,
Mm.
knock out a castle. But yeah, castle is very scary. My plan was going in that I'm, maybe playing red purple once or twice max. I didn't play it at all day one, so um, if they hit their nut curve of Flynn Sisu Castle going first, that it is what it is. I either have the perfect cards to barely come back and they kind of whiff and peter out, but uh, if they hit, they hit. Those are all
Yeah.
Flynn, Sisu, and Castle are all four ofs, and you can't expect to hit it every game. So I think I was more scared of top decking Rise when I really needed a that one last threat or that one last answer that I was of Queen's Castle.
Well, I also think, would your opinion change? Because I think green purple is likely to enter the meta, considering its rogue performance in the Chicago DLC.
Yeah, that was interesting. I think most people wrote off green purple being completely dead, especially because of Artabax himself. Like
Mm.
after the second day of playing Pixel War, and set 4 was like he moved to red purple, so people were like, okay, it's done. If Artabax can't play it, then neither can I. Um, I'm not super familiar with. I'd be curious to know what that guy ran into all of day one and day two. I'm still not a huge believer in the deck of green purple. I think it's not great this set. I think last set it had its chance against a lot of greedy decks just going under
Mm.
them. But this set, even red blue got a lot of stuff to deal with. Those just a lot of hard removal.
And
Brawl
now the
isn't
greedy
super
decks are
efficient.
Brawl, Sisu. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not Brawl is not super efficient, but I mean late game if you're double spelling because you had a strong Flavisham ramp engine, play Medusa Brawl, that's two things off their board. That can be just completely crippling for a deck that just needs to get their last four lore. So and yeah, like you said, Sisu as well is crazy
Yeah.
against anything aggressive. There's not much that they have that's more than three attack naturally, so
And
it's
even
gonna
if they
be a
do, they
pretty.
have a couple ice cubes in there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so a lot of times Sisu is just a lot of times these green decks are just praying, okay, oh, I hope their last card's not Sisu. I ripped the
Mm.
rest of their hand, but yeah, if green is, I'd be very welcoming to green purple. The green purple is, I think I probably have an 80% win rate across all the formats versus green purple. Steel just Tinkerbell is an absolute menace to green purple until I mean
Yeah.
I guess green purple got Bruno this set, which is could be big. It might be bigger than I'm thinking. Because previous sets all green purple had was Mother Knows Best, and that's not really cutting against Tinkerbell. You just replay it each turn, and by the second time they bounce it, you've done 3 damage to everything. And they have no board, so I guess Bruno is like kind of an answer. But if you still have a hand, you can just replay the Tinkerbell. You're not super concerned. They'd have to get lucky and rip the Tinkerbell actually.
Yeah, green purple's not as discard focused, so I think you're more likely to keep your answer. The key threat really being the Ursa on 2 to discard your grab your sword.
Yeah, if they, I mean, if they rip the grab your sword and you don't have a Tinkerbell that you're ramping into, sometimes green purple can still, slide under the radar for you. But
Mm.
I'd say most of the time, blue steel would be happy to see anything green. To be honest, you just want to see the low to the ground stuff that gets destroyed by Tinkerbell and swords.
Yeah, okay. And just to circle back, a really interesting topic I want to bring up was how do you think your matchup fares into especially the mirror that is running wheel, but also wheel decks in general? Because blue steel has always felt like a deck that benefits a lot from the benefit of drawing 7 cards from wheel, and obviously with Quill you still have that ability. But without running wheel ourselves and in those wheel mirror matchups, often the first person to play wheel and spend resources on it, especially if they hard cast it, would lose. So do you think that gives this deck an edge into other wheel decks?
Yeah, you definitely have the edge against blue steel mirror for this deck. Not only was the no wheel version of the deck that picked up crabs. The wheel version also picked up, running 3 to 4 crabs.
Mm.
So, but they didn't pick up running Hades, so they stayed with Let It Go. So you kind of have like the much more efficient and threatening answer to their Tamatoas, um, whereas they, rely on like 1 or 2 Let It Go to pray to hit versus you. And yeah, running no wheel is absolutely beneficial. So you're kind of sculpting your hands and curve around not having to wheel, but if you can also play the tempo game if you go in second and you know that they're trying to wheel, you're just gonna prioritize, you know, dropping the most tempo board you can and threatening to, one shot their Cogsworth with your Smee plus whatever you played. If they do sing the wheel, and then you're just going into a super strong board of like Tamatoa, and then if you Tamatoa, I Hades your Tamatoa. So
Yeah.
um, and then there's those games where, you know, they don't hit on their wheel, and your deck is just built much more, um,
To benefit a lot more from the top decks, right?
yeah, just to benefit a lot more without wheeling. So they're going to be drawing, Grandma Tala and Along Came Zeus, whereas you're drawing Tamatoa, and if they play a Tamatoa, you're playing Hades. So uh, the games where they don't wheel and that happens, it seems very unfair because as long as you don't completely brick, you're probably just dropping much bigger threats than they are each turn. They kind of just hyper ramped into pray they hit wheel the next turn. So if funny enough, my first 4 rounds of Swiss was the blue steel mirror. I don't know how that happened. I'm not sure what the meta share of blue steel was, but um, I ended up going two 2-0s and two 1-1s. But the 2 games where I went 1-1 was like super close. Like the every game I went second, I was one turn away, and they like had to drop like a bell with like one card left in hand with a dime down to be able to close out the game. It was like
Yeah.
super close. It felt so. I think the blue steel mirror, the non-wheel version, definitely benefits the most.
So on the note of matchups, so you're favored into the blue steel mirror. That's one of the big four. You said you're not favored. It's a bad matchup into red purple. Things like Queen's Castle, and I assume the Flynn Sisu combo is quite a hard opener to deal with without running much removal in this version. And I think you feel confident into Emerald Steel too. But I assume red blue is another weak matchup within the big four meta threat.
Yeah, I think this set meta, I'm the most unsure about how I feel against matchups. I think I can confidently say that red blue is still your worst matchup, your
Mm,
most feared thing. But I do think red purple has certain lines. Like if they hit the Flynn Sisu Castle, that's going first. I mean that beats almost every deck.
yeah.
I believe. Um, it's very tough to dig yourself out of that hole going second. So there are decks that can have scarier lines for sure. I think red purple isn't necessarily a bad matchup. I think I know I definitely have a positive matchup on Pixelborn, but um, top 32 I played a very good red purple player, and I felt pretty confident into that. He did build his deck a little bit different. He wasn't even playing Flynn's. He was playing much more like low to the ground. Just
Mm,
yeah, I call them spinning wheel decks because they kind of just play on curve and then they start spinning their wheels with bouncing rabbits and drawing cards and cards from Queen's Castle. So they don't do anything super unfair, but they kind of just outvalue you if you don't have a crazy strong card engine.
yeah.
Um, so I was able to take him down. I do think the Sisu Flynn version is scarier because they have that nut draw, but you can't really look at a deck solely based on their perfect curve. Like that's just not going to happen every game. And I think people actually look at red blue a little bit too safely because when you think about it, if red blue doesn't hit their popsicle on one, their one jump into Flavisham, they're not doing anything super unfair. They like I'd say they do like pretty fair stuff if they don't hit their nut draw every time. But when they do hit their nut draw, it just feels unwinnable. So I think that's why people kind of get jaded
Yeah, I think one
against
one
red
jump is
blue.
the key differentiator. Playing red blue, which I didn't play much in previous sets, but I was obviously testing a lot more in set four. It really did feel like a game of how hard can I mulligan for this one jump, because it just felt
Yeah,
like the
no,
most
and I
efficient path to having to stabilizing the board against any deck.
I think it's kind of a scary path that we're going down a little bit. That we're getting more and more of these efficient cards that if you curve out with your like 3 most efficient cards in your deck, then it's very hard to come back if your opponent doesn't do the exact same thing. Sometimes even if they do the same thing, it's just that going first was enough. So I think the power creep of having these super powerful 4-ofs is like a little bit of a problem with the game, and I think that's something that might have to be addressed because now we have, like I explained, of course, the Flynn Sisu Castles, your perfect 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop that you can only run 4 of. Green can kind of do the same thing with, Bucky, Diablo, plus, anything, just
Yeah,
any other Floodborn. Um, and red blue, of course, one popsicle, one jump into Flowershim. I think one of the reasons why I love blue steel is because it's one of the few decks where you can not sacrifice a whole lot of power, but you can run like 7 to 8 versus 4 of these powerful cards. We can run
mm,
8 reasonable 2-drops. We don't have to high roll the SME every game. We can run 8 turn 3 plays with ramp. We can run 4 quills, 4 Mickey, or even 4 1 jump if we wanted. And then of course you can run plenty of answers after you ramp. There's plenty of good efficient things. So I think that's one of the reasons why I was drawn to blue steel is because of how much more consistently you can do your strongest lines just by the way you build the deck.
yeah. That's definitely out of the scope for this video, but I do think it's interesting how the the very powerful Lorcana Mulligan almost exacerbates the wound of these super polarizing cards and incentivizes taking away nuance away from the Mulligan and just searching for those ultra specific powerful cards that you want in your opening hand.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mind the mulligan changing too much for that because I've always been somebody who's been like one of the most aggressive mulliganers. I
Mm.
think the game is just designed around
Well, I think that's
okay,
what makes the game
you
great.
need to
Yeah.
yeah, you need to risk it for your strong lines, and if if you don't hit, you're probably gonna have a mediocre line anyways. So why play the safe game and just go for these average plays and safe inks? I think people definitely ink on the side of too safe more than
Mm.
too risky, I would say, in this game.
Oh,
I
I've
think,
noticed in
and
coaching, a lot of players will keep a card around just because they can guarantee it's inkable. But I think a lot of that seems to come from just like a failure avoidance, where they're too scared of the low probability outcome, but they don't go for the on average better outcome for a better hand.
right, I think that sometimes comes down to deck building. I think if you should build your deck in mind with that, I need to be able to aggressively mulligan, and so that honestly that this game is an interesting aspect of deck building in this game is that you people are finding out that you should build around your mulligan. Like once you
Mm,
get familiar with the deck and the lines, you should be like, okay, well maybe I can trim this because, or maybe I can add an extra, two drops because that means I can mulligan away my two drops that aren't as good in this matchup, and I can still reasonably expect to see at least something on two. So like that's like a super powerful aspect that kind of gets overlooked in the sea of variance and numbers that are just hidden below the surface in a card game like this.
yeah, especially with the inkable versus uninkables, it heavily affects how you mulligan cards and how you and what cards you keep and how you obviously ink cards and how much flexibility you have and what cards to play based on what cards you have to ink.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of room for people to use, different tools, different like Excel calculators for certain mulligans and decks. But
I know Frank Carsten, the little champion, definitely was.
yeah, it's interesting because this game is like, I know he comes from Magic, so
Mm,
they use certain calculators and stuff. But I actually think that there's a lot more room, at least on a surface level, to do certain stat problems to get immediate like results from them. I think this game has like a lot of potential to reap the benefits of like the small choices
mm.
from certain stats that you run like that.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that it's going to be a lot harder to get these sort of stats now to be able to understand the game more without the sheer volume of online games we had from Pixelbon. So going
No,
forward, I think, I mean, especially with a deck like this, right? Like, I actually wanted to save this question for the end, but I think this is quite relevant now with this conversation, especially for a deck like this, where you made a really quite, bold decision in removing the whole new world. Would you have felt as comfortable testing it if you couldn't get the volume of games that you could get in online testing?
absolutely not. I really play off stream, so I think people can attest to pretty much a Pixelborn only practice person. I don't have like a testing group that I go and grind out games like a week before. Um, so Pixelborn was a super important tool for me to grind out games. Like you
Mm,
can't even in paper with a testing group, stuff just goes so much faster when you're grinding games online. Everybody at the top ladder is like plays fairly quickly. They're in it for like the data, especially when they're coming up for a tournament. So that you're kind of just playing against like these same people that you would want to be grinding with, but you can kind of speed up the games because there's no shuffling, there's no fiddling around with cards. It's much easier to see all like your opponent's graveyard, your ink, count things much faster. So you can really just jam these games and get pretty good data on your deck changes, which is fantastic, especially if you just want to change a couple things and you're just like, oh, maybe I think I can, what if I see, Ariel more often in this matchup? Is that gonna, help me out? And then you can just throw those changes in and then run a couple matchups versus red blue and see if it actually helped. Um, Numbers is always the problem with card games. You need large sample sizes to feel confident for anything. I think Hearthstone is a good example of a game that might maybe has too much numbers because it kind of drowns out the creativity. So I think there is a fine line that you don't want to cross as far as like analyzing hard data and letting that dictate everything within a card game and saying well the meta solved after the first week, so what are we doing? We're just copying the list that did well, which I think Hearthstone does struggle with a little bit.
I mean, there is also that problem of once people start over focusing on the data almost informs the data because there's a critical mass where when enough people are following these stat sites, content creators on what is the best thing to do, and there's less experimentation on breaking the best thing, which reinforces that oppressive feeling of, oh, there's only one meta. It's hard to break. And, a great way to dismantle that was by having a lot of testing volume. And I know a lot of people think with Pixelborn going away, maybe there'll be more variation and more experimentation because people won't be following these content creators online. But I think people will. They'll just be they'll just have less examples of what to follow.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this point because I think this represents the sweet spot of just enough data without having too much to where it's solved.
Mm.
I think if you can have enough data to influence a player base pretty greatly, but still have room for something to sneak under the radar and perform well at a tournament, I think that's the perfect spot because everybody loves to watch a rogue deck that everybody discounted, just like Atlanta. Nobody expected Purple Mufasa to be taking home the trophy, but here it was. It did, and whether it was the perfect call or it was a mixture of things. It was good enough to fly under the radar of everybody, which is an awesome thing to see in card games. So I think I might be biased because set two I feel like I had a similar experience with Blue Steel. I think Blue Steel was incredibly slept on for how powerful it was in set two.
The Blue Steel set up my YouTube channel because I had done an interview with RMB, made a whole deck profile on the video, had released it a few hours before that first Faya Beastie tournament, and then it did amazingly in that tournament. I was like, wow, it's I really being able to sort of get to the scoop on a rogue deck, I think was a really unique piece of content that gets harder and harder to do as more and more of deck testing and building becomes publicized, and it's probably harder to do now just because it's less likely for a rogue deck to see success if you can't get that testing.
yeah, no, that's awesome that you got in because that was probably a week before somebody else won with Blue Steel, and then I won with Blue Steel, and then
Yeah.
Moyen got second with Blue Steel, and then I came back and got first again with Blue Steel. So yeah, that's getting in before then is like also a fun thing. If your testing group is like, hey man, like I think this deck is good, I believe in it. Like I just wait till it finally has its day in the sun out in a tournament. Like that's also another fun part of TCGs. Uh, yeah, so I hope that it's without Pixelborn, it's still solved enough to have like a definite meta to where people can kind of pick apart and really analyze deck lists to see how they can shape them and optimize them around that known meta. I think Pixelborn is simple enough at this point in its life that it still will be fine to do that,
Mm.
especially with store championships. People love to.
Lorcana is still simple enough in its life.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I should start rephrasing here, but yeah, store championships. The data you get from that, I think, is pretty representative to what people would want to bring to the challenges. So I think you can fill in the blanks enough without
Yeah.
Pixelborn.
I found store championships really interesting because they seem to, at least for me, compared to what I saw in Lille, the set championships seem to represent just a lot more aggro in general. And I don't know if that has to do with people wanting to play a quicker deck in a best of three format, or just that when you have more, not casual, but local players involved that aren't willing or aren't able to travel to, other countries. It's super expensive playing these tournaments. But there's certain types of decks that are more favored.
Yeah, so I think if anybody watches my stream, they're probably tired of hearing me say this for the thousandth time. But when people, the way I view when people like show up to a paper tournament, if they've played Pixelborn, or even if they actually have just played locally at their stores for a while, certain decks, I think everybody, or there's a certain percentage of people that don't want to have like the heat of competition ruin their day per se. They want
Mm.
to not worry about I play in this complex deck with all this ink and all these lines. I don't want to feel bad after this because I think I misplayed and I didn't have a good time. So some people just love to turn their brain off for a day or at least save their mental capacity and just play aggro and just have quick, easy, concise rounds where they can afterwards feel like, well, yeah, I played well. I didn't have very many mistakes, and I had a fun time. So there's definitely a percentage of people that aren't so competitive that they just want to have like a nice easy day. And especially going into the challenges, I think it ramps up even more. You're playing for 9 rounds a day. That's sometimes 10 to 12 hours depending on how fast the tournament is run. So it's very reasonable to value your I guess your brain power throughout the day and try to play something that has quicker rounds than say control mirror matches or back in set 1 and 2 the red purple mirror match. I think people started to lose their sanity a little bit back then. So
Yeah.
it's definitely a factor that you have to think about when going into larger tournaments or just in paper tournaments in general. uh, I think also people see results of Pixelborn and say, hey, or like store championships and say, hey, there's a lot of people running these higher curve red blue red purple decks these days. Like maybe I just get lucky and hit this all day. Maybe I'll everybody loves to gamble a little bit. So if the cards are played out for them, the matchups are right, they'll take their free day too any day.
Okay, so I think just to bring our scope back in to the blue steel deck here, and we'll just ask a few more questions here. First off, do you think fire cannons and magic broom and well, really grab your swords too has been enough to counter how much of a threat Diablo has been within the meta?
Yeah, I think they've been more than a threat. I actually only played against green once all of Chicago. Um, So I didn't get even the chance to like play the brooms or the cannons too often against
Mm,
green. Um, but I think my win rate against green steel on Pixelborn is like 78% for set 4. So I think it's more than enough. I think there's plenty of games where you don't even need the cannon or need the broom as long as you hit like a Smee and have a reasonable curve. You're bound to find a Tinkerbell or a sword at some point if you draw some cards with Flavisham. So I think that matchup is probably the matchup that I would consider cutting those tech cards for the most. I was kind of considering testing out with like no cannon and seeing how it felt, just because I think it's maybe not even needed if you play broom. Like you could maybe even swap a cannon for a broom and just say like, okay, well this still is a good card against this matchup. I'm not like taking out one good card, but it's also inkable. So like against
yeah,
every other matchup, it has more versatility to it.
especially with no wheel, it feels cannon is even brickier than it was before.
Yeah, Cannon, I have a love-hate relationship with that card. I try to not play it when I can, but I convinced myself that okay, well, we still play Fishbone Quill. So against red blue, we want to be playing Fishbone Quill. We'll just get rid of it then. But I do think yeah, there's room for if there's any changes that can be made, especially if we think green is going to be played a little bit less. I think you can kind of experiment with those flex spots with that are really just there for the green matchup.
Yeah, on the note of an impressive 78% win rate into Emerald Steel, something we missed from your introduction is, but correct me if I'm wrong, congratulations on being top 10 win rates in Pixelborn for players with over 1,000 games, right?
Yeah, thank you. I think I snuck in there at number 10, so
I
I
mean, it's pretty. You had one of the highest game counts, I believe, within that top 10 list, along with Moyen. So it's pretty impressive to hold it that high for that long.
I don't think I did. I think you might be thinking of somebody else. I think it was
Didn't
like
you have like 1,600?
I think I had 1300,
Oh, okay.
but there was somebody on there with like over 3000, so I don't think I was quite
I completely missed
quite
that. I was
that high.
glancing at it on Twitter this morning. 3,000 is insane.
I mean, don't get me wrong, 1300 games is a ridiculous amount, especially if that's just wins. So that's like,
Yeah,
or I guess no, that is total games. So,
total games. Yeah.
but compared to a casual player, that's like a lifetime of play. So.
I think it really goes to show that, yeah, I mean, you've mainly been one tricking Blue Steel, right? Like 95% of the time?
Yeah, that's another thing with it is
Mm.
that you have to keep in mind that I pretty much sold my soul to this color combination. So take that with a grain of salt. There wasn't a whole lot of experimenting done with other colors. Um,
I mean, I think it's not necessarily a detriment against you though, because you're also playing blue steel when the meta might not necessarily call for it.
right. I think a lot of people every set have kind of discounted that. Okay, well, what is he gonna do now? Blue steel. There's no way it survives. They got no cards this set. But every set, people slowly come around to okay, well, yeah, blue steel is just still good. It's just a generically good curve that you're doing. You still have good tools. So I mean even myself I think set 4 I was a little bit scared with how much red blue was being played, but I think I surprised myself with how much room for adaptation there was within blue steel to
Mm.
combat that. I mean, I guess it was, pretty hard pressed to believe that no wheel was the way to go initially, being like somebody who has reaped the benefits of wheel for 2 sets straight and just felt the power of it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of room to actually adapt your list with the given card pool to keep blue steel relevant, even if you're not given a whole lot of efficient new cards to play with.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really brilliant adaptation as well. I think it makes sense with the Fortisphere. I remember I had an offshoot message when we saw Fortisphere with RMB, like, oh, maybe we don't need a wheel anymore. But I never really took it further than that and took it seriously. So it's really cool to see what you've done here. I mean, but so to carry on, I'm going to let's keep going to some more card specifics. So there has been some talk around Ariel about it being more of a win more card. Um, and I think that argument works a lot less well against the wheel version of a deck because you have those excess resources to drop it in the same turn as a dime. But in this deck, where you're playing only one card a turn, how do you best utilize Ariel to make her most effective, especially into the red blue matchup and the mirror, where you might not always have more items than your opponent?
Yeah, so going into this set, I was actually not super hyped about that Ariel. I thought that Bell was still going to be the way to go, and it still might be with the wheel version. I'm not sure. I haven't tried it a whole lot. Um, but I kind of discounted it because I was like, well, I mean, not only do you have to have more items than red blue, which they're playing a lot of items, but it can still just die to B prep or Tremaine if you don't have protection. So why are we playing this card? I was actually more excited about the steel Ariel that you pay 2 whenever
Yeah.
you play a song and deal 3 damage. I was like, this card is sick. Like, if this doesn't get removed, like it's just gonna take over the game. Which that card actually is very good in the situations where it doesn't just get Medusa, but of course it's 3 attacks, so that's a big problem.
I mean, Dice to
Um,
Medusa is very ever present within the meta.
yeah, that's a bit of a label that you don't want on a card that you wish to play. So no, but Blue Area it was crazy. You said that you might think that you need like, oh, you need to wheel, get all your items, have much more mana to utilize the dime with it, but it's actually, I think it works much better in the no wheel version, which is
Mm.
why I play 3 of them. Not only do you need more to just see it without wheeling, but if you're not giving your opponent like their perfect answers by refilling them with a whole new world, they need like very like good luck to draw multiple answers to aerials, because sometimes like you'll play the first aerial, you'll get a couple lore with it, but then they'll find their one answer. But then the time you play the second aerial, it's like it's just there's nothing they can do unless they top deck like the perfect card in their deck.
Mm.
um so yeah, aerial is just crazy. So it's mainly there for red blue, but it actually, I've noticed that it helps speed up like tons of matchups. Red purple especially, like you force their B prep and then you play aerial, and hopefully that wins you the game, especially if you have a dime. Or you can, play the dime first if you're going first, let them B prep, you're still there with a dime, then you play an aerial quest for 5 or activate the dime for 5, and then you're threatening 10 more the next turn if they don't play another B prep or a Tremaine or something. So Ariel is just a very crazy card to put because it has ward. You
Yeah.
force them to find their exact couple answers in their deck, which they probably don't have a whole lot of cards because you're not wheeling. So it's going to be hard to do.
Yeah, but it's definitely a very true difference. Often when you're wheeling opponent, say in previous blue steel games where we would play McDuck's mana, you wheel your opponent and boom, there's their Rise of Titans, there's their Zeus, or whatever they need to answer. So not giving your opponent all those cards and still having a fairly robust draw engine is a good way of maintaining that advantage asymmetric.
Yeah, absolutely. Making your opponent draw answers without giving it to them is turns out it's pretty good.
Yeah. And on the note of playing a lot of items, how has the abundance of Bloodborne Aladdin, especially with an Emerald Steel as a tech, been for this matchup?
Yeah, so that is a card that actually can sometimes be much scarier than Diablo. I will say that you have some room to play around it, much more, especially if you are playing Mickey on 3 versus
Hmm.
Fishbone Quill. Um, but even if you
I mean,
Fishbone
you
Quill,
wouldn't even want to
you
play
get,
Quill in that matchup because of a discard, right?
yeah, you much prefer Mickey in that matchup, but you'll still probably always ramp if unless you have some crazy, alternative turn 3 play into Flavisham or something.
Yeah.
So usually it involves like cannoning their Diablo after they shifted and they have 2 cards in their hand or something like that. But No, Aladdin can be for sure scary. If you quill, you're pretty much guaranteed to have one popsicle to Flavisham, so you'll get two cards still, but it kind of shuts off that free win of like, okay, I play my Flavisham and I have one more item. Like you cannot discard through four cards, so you just win. So you kind of are forced to draw like another popsicle or something, which isn't tough with eight popsicles, but sometimes it doesn't happen and you're really just struggling, I guess, off the top to just okay, I need to draw my Tinkerbells, I need to draw my Simbas and stuff like that, my swords, because three health is a lot more than two. Three health does not die to swords. It survives a lot of stuff. It doesn't die to the broom. So Aladdin can be annoying, but overall, like I said, that matchup is still like heavily favored. So even with the anti-item stuff, it's not too big of a deal. I think if Aladdin also had that effect when you played him like Benja did, then there would be a
Hmm.
problem
I
because
mean,
then you could
that would be
just
insane. On play and questing. That would be like imagine giving that to a card like Haram Flavisham.
yeah, if they had the ETB as well, you'd be in trouble because if they went first, then they could play Aladdin, get rid of your popsicle that you played on one, and then just be ready to get rid of anything else. You'd have to skip your quill turn almost to not have it just get dumpstered, and then your Flaversham has nothing. So it'd be messy for sure.
Right. So I'm going to get a couple more questions in here because I think we're about wrapping it up time wise. But one final card specific question is you're only running 2 copies of Develop Your Brain, which does feel quite blasphemous as a long-time Blue Steel player. But I assume it has something to do with the curve being a lot tighter with less spare ink without the Whole New World plus quill combo. It's probably harder to fit in that 1 ink cost, right?
Yeah. So develop your brain. I've been no stranger to just like saying it's like one of my favorite cards, and I think it's crazy to cut it in past sets, but it does change a little bit without wheel and with uh, mainly just the four extra popsicles.
Hmm.
I will say the two develop your brain is the part of the deck that I'm the most unsure about. I think the rest of the deck I'm pretty confident that in this meta it's your most basic unless you're trying to make a meta call. It's probably what you want to go with. Um, but the develop your brain, I'm not sure. It's very hard to analyze a card like that uh, when you're like also changing the deck completely from no wheel because you want big threats and develop your brain does help you find big threats, but you're also not ramped as much anymore. You're much more of a play
Hmm.
a character on curve deck. So sometimes like you can't fit the develop. Like you just okay, I have 6 ink, so I play tank. Next turn I have 8 ink, so I play Tamatoa. You don't have like the one extra ink nearly as much to find those answers, especially like when you're probably fitting in with popsicles. So it does get inked a lot, and it's much less played in this deck. You don't like ever keep it anymore because you just want popsicles, like in your starting hand. Um, but I will say that it's in there mainly in this version because it's a flexible top deck. Once you
Yeah.
get once you get to late game and you're in those spots where you have like one or none cards left and you're just like, okay, I need to top deck something. It's a card that can get you that last threat and dig you deeper, or it's still that card that you play early on versus green or something, and it can find you that sword or find you that cannon that wins you the game. So it is very flexible, and that's why I still think it's meant to be in the deck. But the reason why I'm unconfident is because that's a very strong argument to me to play four of them, but I just don't know what else I would cut. So
Hmm.
maybe some of these tech cards for green, maybe a cannon and I don't know a broom. We could go down to 6/2 drops, but we'll we'll, we'll have to see. I'm not sure how much better my chances are of finding that out now that Pixelborn is gone, but
Yeah, it's really hard to test those those like finer details. I mean, even then, even if you played 100 games, quite a small sample size, you sort of just have to rely on theory a lot of the time. But we're getting so much less of a taste of that portion, which inadvertently could be a good thing. Maybe we'll follow our own biases less if we're just having to do it strictly off theory.
yeah, no, that and certain cards like that are pretty much strictly theory only. Like if I don't know if you're familiar with Magic, but cards like Brainstorm and Ponder, like everybody will tell you, just insane. But they're not insane when you play them. They're just insane for what they enable. So like if you don't,
Mm,
there's not like some crazy effect or character attached to them. It's tough to see like, oh, this helped me in this matchup. You kind of like tend to brush off like the times where you develop your brain and hit your answer, or you develop your brain into taking two awful top decks off of your deck that probably would have lost you the game if you didn't play it. So it's a very tough card to like feel confident about. Yeah, this card wins me this matchup, or this card helps me here. It it's not like a I don't know, like a Tinkerbell. It's like bam, I win the aggro
Yeah.
matchup because I play this. Like this is good. Like you only have to play like one best of three versus aggro to understand that Tinkerbell is what you want versus that matchup as a four of. But develop your brain is much more, yeah, like obscure. I'm not sure the math that would have to go into like actually proving that you should play, four of develop your brain versus two, or like it's
Oh,
either play four develop your brain or none at all. It doesn't make sense to play like under four copies.
yeah, I don't know what math it would take, considering you'd also need to take into account the varying stages of spare ink you could have during the game.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most math that, or at least thought process that went in for me. I was like, well, we're not turbo ramping, so like sometimes you just can't fit it in, so I
Hmm.
won't go four copies.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think more importantly, maybe for this kind of ratio, is you just consider whether or not you want 10 or 8 draw one cards.
Yeah, I mean for sure. With eight popsicles, you're never keeping develop typically in your starting hand, just because, especially in this version, because of how important Flavisham is. But uh, it still is definitely played on three after Quill. Like it can help you set you up still early on. It's not just the top deck that is like a flex card for
Mm.
sure.
All right, and I want to go into our final question here, which is quite open ended because we've talked for a good time, learned lots of good stuff. Good to hear about the deck. With the note of everything you've played with this deck in Chicago, would you still recommend this sort of list and not running a whole new world for players like myself heading to Bochum in a few weeks?
Yeah, I've talked to quite a few people, and I did coaching for a while, so I had quite a few students that I've said, you should try in the wheel version. A lot of them come to me after, they message me and they say, hey, congratulations on Chicago, but I don't think I can get behind a no wheel version. I think I'm too attached to the lines of turbo ramp and wheel. But I would encourage like anybody who thinks that, or they're like married to wheel, to try this version, because at first I would have thought that it's much less fun than just like having the wheel and getting to 15 ink and sometimes more. Those games are insanely fun, especially as somebody who likes to play multiple Mickeys and sneak in the Mickey with the 5 drop here and there to keep getting crazy ramp. This version actually surprised me at how fun it was, and for how many games I've played, how fun it's remained. Um, I think I think a lot of that has to do with you tend to think through your curve a lot more
Mm.
because you don't have access to so many cards. You kind of have to think ahead a few turns, more like say red blue has a quill out, and you have to think, if they ramp this turn and that maybe they want a Tamatoa next turn, so I need to shape my curve around, wanting to Hades on this turn, or like prioritize quill in this matchup because I need to have an answer for this and this on this turn. So I think there is like still a different aspect of depth to it. Whereas like wheel, sometimes everybody would say the games that where you're wheeling and dealing going first, anybody could win those games. If you've played Blue Steel before, you have such an egregious advantage. Those games where you're just triple and quadruple spelling each turn, that even if they have multiple B preps, you can just vomit your hand out the next turn and sing another wheel. Um, so those games are typically the easiest. It's the games where things go wrong, or
Yeah.
things you're not super ramped, that the mistakes can bite you and you really have to think through. So there is still an aspect of this version that's very kind of, you think ahead like chess or something like that. Um, and I also will say that it in that same vein, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it is, I think, more simple than the wheel version to a beginner. I think most decks that people play are much more can relate much more to this deck that's just more of a curve deck. I play my 2 drop, I play my ramp, they get that I skip this turn, but then I'm just playing good stuff after that, which is much more intuitive to like somebody who's just picking up blue steel.
It's definitely much more mid-rangey than it used to be.
Yeah, for sure, which is it's just a nice change. You like to play different genres of decks and card games, or else you get kind of stale.
Yeah.
But going into Fort Worth, I think the deck for sure holds up. It's the same meta. Um, I think especially because the top two decks, red, blue, and green, steel, were very prevalent in day two of Chicago. I'd be hard pressed to see that the meta changes too much.
Mm.
I think the meta would have a much better chance of changing, given if people took more red purple or something, or they took their comfort pick rather than choosing the obvious deck that got the most upgrades from set 4. So I don't think those decks are going anywhere for Texas, and I think even though red blue is your worst matchup, it's much better without the wheel. I think it's much closer to 50-50 if it's not already 50-50 with Hades. Maybe you can optimize the deck to make it 50-50 if it's not. So if green is still on the radar, I think you're for sure, okay to confidently take this deck to Texas.
I think green definitely feels like one of those decks where that is going to show up a lot in Top Cut, but doesn't necessarily, as you said, you didn't see many in the Swiss. It won't necessarily have a high representation just due to how pricey the list is. Like all the cards are so expensive, especially those legendary.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing for sure. And I think green steel is a little bit viewed as like a more casual deck because it's a little bit lower to the curve. Like if you can nail down your first 4 turns, that kind of sets you up for whether this game is going to be a win or a loss. So it's kind of interesting that one of the more low to the ground decks is
Mm.
by far the most expensive. You play Robin Hood, Beast, Diablo, Ursula. So like
Mm.
literally the most expensive cards in the game.
All four of them in the same deck. Yeah,
Yeah,
full
yeah.
playsets.
Each set they just gets more expensive and more expensive. So I think we're at the point though where unless it's a non-character card that gets crazy expensive, I think they're running out of character slots to play. So they're gonna have to give up one of these expensive cards.
Mm.
And it seems like some people are already giving up Robin Hood. So maybe the price will go down some if the meta changes at all. We'll see. But yeah, for now it's crazy. I think it's probably what at least $1,000 or getting close to $1,000.
I mean, man, I'm a content creator for this game, and I can't afford that deck. So that's
Yeah, no,
really
for
all you need to
sure.
know about
I'm just
it.
I'm just glad I've Blue Steel is still in my opinion the best deck because I'm not trying to dish out a bunch of money for another deck, especially like I originally was like I foiled out Blue Steel after I was like fell in love with it, so I'm definitely not trying to foil out that deck for sure.
Well, I mean, I'm also very budget minded and have been looking into a few options for this tournament. As is tradition with me, I still have not decided what I'm bringing. I'd like to give myself at minimum 2 weeks though, so I'll definitely be hitting you up in DMs more to see what your current version looks like and where you take it for Bochum. Because who knows? Maybe I'd love to try my hands at no wheel blue steel for Bochum.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, other than the sad beast, the deck is insanely cheap. You don't even play Bell anymore, so that was
Well, I've got all those cards, so that's not an issue for me. In fact, I feel like I'm making money because you've made Hades useful again. So I feel like I've just gotten back, like 80 quid.
yeah, we'll see. Hopefully, I mean, hopefully more people will hop on board. I mean, I guess I hope they don't because this list plays heavily into Tamatoa, and if they have the Hades, it's much worse. That's one of the reasons why you're kind of favored against Blue Steel. But
Hmm.
I'm all for Hades. It was one of my favorite cards, so I'm super glad to be playing it again.
That's definitely my biggest takeaway from this interview that I missed when I played the deck without watching any of your games, and it's that I don't think I ever valued the Turbo Tamatoa line as much. I was still playing it much more like a traditional Blue Steel curve.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing. If once you play the deck a lot more, you'll understand the value of playing like just using your 5 drops or 6 drops as ink sometimes for
Mm.
Tamatoa. There's a lot of times where like if you're going turbo Tamatoa, you get to 6, so you're not quite or like if you play Mickey especially, you need to like take another turn to ramp almost before Tamatoa or else it's like too slow.
Mm.
So sometimes you'll like instead of playing like a beast or like a Tinkerbell even, you'll like play a Mickey plus a popsicle for a turn, and that just sets you up for Tamatoa next turn. But uh, even if Beast would have drawn you a card, that is like the Mickey plus popsicle is like worth the value because you get to Tamatoa one more turn early, and you pretty much get an extra card via the popsicle that turn. So kind of makes up for the misdraw.
I mean, if that's like your nuts line, is there ever an opening mulligan where you say, "Hey, I've already got Popsicle, Smee, Quill, and Tomatora in my hand. I just keep all of them and ink the rest"?
I wouldn't say it's your nuts line, but it does happen for sure. Your nuts line going first is always like popsicle Smee into ramp into Hiram.
Mm.
Um, but sometimes like I guess there is some situations where it is your nut draw, just like taking an extra turn to ramp into Tamatoa, but I don't think it's consistent enough to where I would keep a Tamatoa. Or like I mean, it's already tough enough to have like Popsicle Smee plus ramp like in
Mm.
your starting hand without mulliganing. Because sometimes if you know the matchup, the broom isn't even good enough. So like you'll even pitch that, just hunt for Smees, especially if you're going second, just because you're like, well, I just need my good curve. We'll hope for that.
Yeah, the Poland tournament in set three, it felt like half my games were decided, but by me hard mulliganing for Smee because if your Quill was going to get bare necessity, you just needed some board tempo to stabilize.
Yeah, for sure. Like it. thankfully Steel Song isn't quite as prevalent. I actually do think this version does better against Steel Song because you have the Hades and you don't have to
And
give them
before
the free
Mickey.
refill.
Mm.
But if you miss a character against decks like Steel Song, it's terrible. They just get free Sing Bear necessities with Cindy, and then they can drop whatever they want and just be greedy the whole game. So um, yeah, but I think my philosophy for like keeping I think higher cost cards that you want to see later on is if you can't play it by turn 4 like say Tinkerbell, it's probably not good enough to keep. And that's almost because a lot of your hand if you're already have three things that you want to play is going to be ink. So if you hit like a couple uninkables and you have that Tamatoa, it's just going to your inkwell and that's just one -1 card that you want to see in that matchup. So unless it's like a Tinkerbell and you have Fishbone Quill and like it's a matchup that you want Tinkerbell, I think that's like the limit of what I would keep as far as like cards I want to keep. It's also like the same thing goes for like Cogsworth. I think in previous sets, like unless it was like the blue steel mirror, like people would be like, "Oh, I'm facing Amber Steel. Cogsworth is good, right? I'm gonna keep both of these and just like go like Mickey into Cogsworth. But sometimes I guess it's more prevalent against discard because sometimes you'll have to discard before you have to ink.
Mm.
But sometimes that just means you have to ink that good card, and then that's just okay. You play the first Cogsworth, but you're probably not going to see another one for the rest of the game, which is pretty rough sometimes, especially if it's like I guess Tinkerbell. If you get greedy and like keep a Tinkerbell with like a bunch of and you get a bunch of uninkables, sometimes you have to ink that, and it's like oh well that was my one out. Like now I'm
Yeah.
just top decking for something that I play three of now, so it feels really bad then. So I think trying still keeping low to the ground curve is pretty important.
Mm.
Um, some people like, especially if it's uninkable, a lot of people say, well, you said Hades is like the key to this red blue matchup. Why don't you keep that in your starting hand? And that's a
What?
really dangerous one
Mm.
because some like if you get uninkables, then you might have to ink your like two drop or like your second popsicle or even you might screw yourself over so much trying to keep that value card in your hand that uh, the game doesn't even get to a state where Hades wins you the game. So I think it's much more important to stay a little bit on the safe side as far as big stuff in your opening hand, even if it's a good versus the matchup.
Yeah, no, it's definitely really interesting. I especially talking about the idea of finding your good cards too early or keeping them in hand at the wrong time. I lost a match once on Blue Steel to having four Cogsworths in my opening hand, and there's a part of you that goes, Cogsworth is great in this matchup, but please don't give it to me right now.
Yeah, and then you get the wheeled off of it or something. It's like,
Yeah.
well, that's never happening for the rest of the game now. That's great.
Anyway, we have been talking for a long time, very in depth, over an hour about Blue Steel. I think everyone listening who is a Blue Steel fan is definitely going to be happy about that. But before we sign off, would you have anything you'd like to shout out? Any closing thoughts?
No, not really. I don't think. I'm not sure what the plan for me as far as streaming goes after Pixelborn's death. I might try a couple of games of Tabletop Simulator. So I guess I can shout out my stream. It's just
Yeah.
Sky131313 on Twitch. I'm not sure the next time we'll go live. We'll probably have to make some preparations as far as what we'll be doing. But yeah, other than that, I mean, shout out to some of the guys that I met in Chicago. They were all super cool. It was nice meeting a bunch of fans. It's always fun for people to come up and recognize you. So shout out to all you guys. Sarek and his group of friends were super nice, and it was nice to talk to people that were, equally as competitive and nervous
Mm.
about the event through the Swiss round. So it's always fun to meet people like that. So yeah, other than that though, uh, shout out to you for doing this. I'm always down to ramble about Blue Steel. I probably rambled more about the game than I should have, but I'm sure you can
No,
edit this down to a manageable length of a video. So
hey, if we're treating this like a podcast, I think the most enjoyable part of it is those tangents into those slightly out of scope topics, regardless.
yeah, for sure. I mean that's a fun part of TCGs to me is like anytime there's somebody that's fanatic about a hobby, it's always fun to analyze all the little aspects of it that
Mm.
aren't necessarily just playing the game. So
I mean, someone can ramble to me about anything, and it will make it infinitely more interesting to me learning those nitty gritty details. But yeah, I think
yeah,
that's
for
all for
sure.
today. Thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure to learn more about the deck. I will probably definitely be trying it myself as a longtime fan of Blue Steel. And yeah, if you figure out how to stream Lorcana, let me know, and I'll join you on that.
Yeah, it sounds good. I'll have to tell you how the tabletop simulator goes. But thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure. So
All right, all good, Sky. Have a good one, and bye bye, guys. Hope you enjoyed.